You're listening to the Mezzo Guild podcast.
بس أنا لازم أحسه الأول عشان أقوله.
아직 나의 어색한 한국말이 짤따рат하고 지적하지 말아주세요.
Я хочу с тобой серьезно поговорить.
Really good news, Farragut. No, I can quit this Maldinas a year short.
Language learning made simple. A while back, I had an idea for an experiment to try and replicate as much as humanly possible in-country language immersion at home over Skype. My goal was to truly maximize the potential for online immersion and then to measure its results. The term online or Skype immersion gets thrown around a lot, but I really think that it needs to be quantified, like how much time online, how much time on Skype with a native speaker is necessary for it to be called immersion. It had dawned on me that the reason why I pick up languages like Russian so quickly, why I picked up Russian so quickly while I was living in Russia, was at least primarily because of the amount of time during the day that I was forced to use the language. It was all about time. It had nothing to do with simply being in the target language country. I hardly ever had time to sit around in Russia doing any of the typical comprehension building activities that most people do, like watching Russian shows or memorizing flashcards or reading activities. I really didn't have any time for that while I was there. In fact, I barely ever studied. Rather, for me, the crucial factor was obligatory usage over extended periods of time. I'll say that again. It was obligatory, necessary usage over extended periods of time. In Russia, I worked long hours with Russians, and these were poorer Russians, and none of them spoke any English. None of them spoke a word of English. I had to communicate with them. My job actually required me to get my point across to these people. It was important, so I had to do it. And then I went on to live with my Russian girlfriend at the time who only spoke Russian, and every day was a constant, exhausting slog to communicate with her on a meaningful level. Within 5 months, the whole thing began to feel very, very natural to me. I picked up Russian very, very quickly. So this observation, on reflection, this prompted me to want to do an experiment. I sat down and I did the math. I calculated that on an average day while I was living abroad, I communicated probably an average of about 5 to 6 hours in the target language per day. And that's not just 5 to 6 hours of passive exposure to the language, but that's 5 to 6 hours of actual back and forth communication and negotiation with other people, negotiating meaning with other people. So that's between about 35 to 42 hours per week of grueling language practice. That's active language use. Now compare this to the average learner at home with an online tutor. A lot of people, depending on their motivation level, their availability, and how much money they have, are probably fortunate. They're probably lucky if they get 1 to 2 hours per week of actual language exchange via Skype. Some people might get a few more. It's totally inadequate for serious short-term fluency progress, in my opinion. In fact, I believe that most people are probably lucky if they get 1 to 2 hours per month. The rest of their learning time is taken up by autodidactic or academic activities, books, courses and programs, passive listening activities, and so on. Not to mention the distractions of work, family, and life. This is even true for a lot of people who live in the target language country. And this is, for anyone who's lived in South Korea will know this. You ask all these expats who live in Korea, they live there for years and they can't even get a sentence out in Korean. Just because you're surrounded by opportunities to use the language, just because you may live in the target language country and be surrounded by opportunities, doesn't mean that you take those opportunities. It doesn't mean that you're actually you're using the language with those opportunities. So just to recap what the experiment was, I worked out that if I had tremendous success by being forced to speak for an average of 5 to 6 hours per day in the target language country, in Russia for example, then I need to find a way to put the same or similar expectation on myself while I'm at home if I want comparable results. How can I force myself to have 5 or more hours a day of continuous interaction, of continuous discussion. So what I did was I set up a schedule. I set up a daily schedule for online Skype sessions through italki, mostly through italki, for 5 total hours. So that's 5 total hours a day over Skype of interaction. And so it'd be, for example, between 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. there'd be a lesson, and then from 9 a.m. to 9:30 there would be a break. So I'd get a half an hour break, and then I'd have another hour lesson, and then I'd have another half an hour break, and another lesson, and so on until I got 5 1-hour lessons. And sorry, when I say lesson, these are not sit down, listen to the teacher lessons. These are sessions of communication. These are conversation sessions for 1 hour. So you're talking a lot. These were the rules that I set for myself for these 5 sessions. The first one was that I intentionally limited myself to 1 topic per day. 1 topic to talk about. For example, one topic was that I talked about getting married. And that was all I talked about all day. Every session I had, no matter which teacher I was with or which tutor I was with, had to involve practice talking about the very same topic, and it had to be challenging content to my current level. This was so that I could look back and I could clearly see and measure my progress, because you measure your progress best by learning topics, by learning topic content, because you can look back and say, well, I couldn't talk about that before, but now I can. Another rule that I set was that there was to be no explicit grammar teaching. Okay, no traditional grammar teaching, just talking and negotiating meaning through lots and lots of mistakes. Another rule, a different teacher or conversation partner where possible for every session throughout the day. So have 5 sessions throughout the day. The ideal was to have 5 different people throughout the day to talk to keep it varied, stop it being boring, and just to get a different flavor, I guess. 1 target language per day. Only 1 target language per day, so I couldn't learn multiple languages on one day. There was to be no English during the lessons and during the breaks as well. So when I have the break between the sessions, I'm not allowed to start talking to people in English. I have to continue within. I either just not communicate, or I have to stay in the target language somehow. But I can't go and have an English conversation in the break. And I was fortunate during this because I was home alone most of the time, so it wasn't a problem for me. And lastly, to apply what I learned from one session to the following sessions as a way of practicing and cementing what I had previously learned. So if I learned something, a new word or a new phrase in one lesson, then in the next lesson I would use it. I would find an opportunity to use it and practice it with the next person. Now, I plan to do this with any of my 4 strongest languages, which are Arabic, Korean, Irish, and Russian. First of all, it didn't work out entirely as I had planned. The past 12 months have actually been the most eventful and hectic of my life. I migrated to the US legally. I set up a home, got married, and had my first child. So it's been a lot has been happening, and it means that I've been more distracted this past 12 months than any other time in the past 7 years of running my website, the Mezzofanti Guild. It's been a really welcome change from living out of a suitcase. It's nice to actually have a home finally, but it's been hectic. It's brought with it a series of new challenges for finding time to do things that I've always taken for granted. So maybe I'm experiencing things that most people, a lot of people, have to deal with on a daily basis, which is finding time. It's becoming a challenge for me now because I'm so used to being a vagabond character with all the time in the world. I had initially hoped to do this experiment over a period of 3 to 6 months. I wanted to, because I lived in Russia for 5 months, so I figured if I can do this over a period of 3 to 6 months, it'll be good. But with everything that happened in the last 12 months for me, I was limited to 3 weeks. Now, this was still enough for me to see some very clear results, some great results, but I believe it would have been exponentially better if I had have stuck to it for the initially planned time. And maybe I'll try and do this later on. I encountered 2 other challenges to do with the experiment itself. One was that it would have been far better to focus on 1 language rather than 4. Even for just 3 weeks of 5 hours per day on 1 language alone would have been extremely effective. I was spreading myself too thin, and it proved to me yet again that learning multiple languages simultaneously is not a good thing to do. Number 2, there were minor logistical challenges, most notably dealing with unreliable teachers. You get a lot of those online. For example, I'd schedule 5 sessions a day, and every now and then you'd get 1 or 2 who would cancel, or they just wouldn't show up. Or you get the connection issues, especially with teachers in the Middle East who have really lousy connections. Or you get unavoidable interruptions at home. People come and visit, and it just messes everything up. If I were to do this experiment again, I would increase the amount of sessions in my schedule to accommodate any unforeseen issues. I'd ensure that no matter what happens, whether it's cancellations or distractions on my end, I do get my 5+ hours a day. Now, here's how it went otherwise. My mind adjusted to thinking more spontaneously in the language with less effort as the day went on. So by the time I'd get to the 5th session of the day, I've just had 4 sessions, I get to the 5th session of the day, I'm totally in the zone. Totally in the zone. The first thing in the morning, my mind is still in English mode, especially if I'm communicating with my wife all morning. So the first session is kind of like a warm-up. But after hours and hours of speaking throughout the day to multiple people, multiple native speakers, and refraining from English mental interference, you really start to think in the target language and everything is flowing. You really are in the zone. Natural, spontaneous responses come much more easily. The opportunity to learn something new from one teacher and then reinforce it with a second person helped lock it in my memory. I wish that I could properly explain why this is, how this works. I guess that it's similar to the way in which we learn written vocabulary and then we encounter the same words in other reading material later on. It reinforces what we've learned by seeing a learned word in unfamiliar contexts over a period of time. If you see it, you learn a word on a flashcard, and then later on you're reading a text and you see the word again. It might just look vaguely familiar the first time you encounter it, but the more you do that, the more it solidifies in your memory. And it's the same thing with conversation. Hearing something new from one teacher or tutor and then encountering it again in a sentence by a totally different person later on, hours later, helps to make it concrete. It's spaced repetition, but instead of repeatedly hearing or seeing something in the same place over and over again, like a flashcard or an audio file, you're hearing it from a different voice in a totally different context. One thing I'd like to say is that mental fatigue is a daily struggle when you do this. Whenever I do overseas language immersion, I'm always totally exhausted. It's really exhausting. Part of this is because I'm an introvert. I get really, really drained when I'm around people constantly if I don't get my me time to recharge. I struggle to be around people constantly all day long. And I know most people are kind of like that, but introverts especially are like this. Most of it is spending 5+ hours a day struggling with the language. It's being a serious mental workout. It's very, very strenuous. It's hard work. Similarly, in doing this experiment, I found that by the 4th and 5th session, I felt totally wrecked. I didn't feel like doing anything social in the evening because I had been switched on all day. I'd been actively communicating, speaking all day long. I was just ready to just shut up and watch a TV show in the evening. I was just done. It also meant that my ability to focus and problem solve got really sloppy toward the end of the day. This is something that I could adjust to over a period of time. If I was to do this for a long period of time, I'd probably get better at it. As I've had to do this during overseas immersion in the past, when I've worked really long hours and I've had to communicate in Russian all day long, you adjust to it because you have to. But you really need to give it all of your energy and focus. Language immersion should be treated like a full-time job. You should see it as a full-time job. Overall, the experiment that I did confirmed what I believe to be true about language immersion. This has totally confirmed it for me. And that is that rapid progress in the languages that I've learned, or for anyone who's been overseas and learned a language really quickly, it's made possible through extended periods of usage, not just exposure. It's not just about being there. It's not just about being in the country. It's about using it in the country constantly. Continuous usage. And sitting and listening to a native speaker talk to you and you just sit there and listen is not counted as usage. Usage is you and the native speaker going back and forth. Simply being in the country means nothing. Expats all over the world live in the target language country, and yet they rarely, if ever, truly experience immersion in the language. Why is that? Because continuous usage over extended periods of time is very, very uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable process. It's not easy. And it leaves you with nowhere to hide. You have nowhere to hide. You can't run away. There's a person staring at you, waiting for a question, a statement, or a response. English is not an option. There's just nobody there to jump in the conversation to draw attention away from you. You know, if you're in a group of people overseas and, you know, one of them is or you got two native speakers there, and I find there's a tendency for, you know, when we feel overwhelmed to kind of sink back a little bit and let the other person kind of carry the burden of the conversation. But when you're doing what I've done with this experiment, it's just you staring at another person, and that's it. You know, there's no one there to interfere. Yesterday, I actually sat down to do some calendar planning because I like to plan my day's activities so I can keep myself consistent with my work. And what I've decided to do from now on is that instead of doing the occasional lesson here and there online through italki, I'm going to dedicate whole days. I'm going to choose a few days throughout the month, and I'm going to dedicate entire days that are going to be language use days, immersion days. So rather than just doing one session here and there, I'll be doing all of my sessions as marathons, as full-day marathons. I recommend you give it a try. Yeah, if you work full-time Monday to Friday, maybe just choose one Saturday or one Sunday and just make it a full language immersion day. Just book out a bunch of sessions online and just spend the whole day speaking, using the language, and see what happens.